The stench of gasoline hung in the air like an unwelcome guest as Marcus jogged down the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. Broken streetlights flickered, casting jagged shadows over the graffiti-covered walls. He didn't mind the darkness. It was safer that way, less chance for anyone to see him. He wasn't running from anything. He just liked the way the cool night air made him feel like he was flying, escaping the weight of the world. At 17, Marcus had already seen enough to make him question whether things would ever get better. The neighborhood he called home was a dead end for most kids his age. Crime, poverty, and broken dreams seemed to be the only things the future had to offer. But Marcus wasn't like the others. He had dreams, plans. He wasn't going to end up another statistic. That's when he heard the screeching of tires. Around the corner, a sleek black car swerved violently, crashing into a lamppost with a thunderous bang. Sparks flew, and the windshield shattered. Marcus froze, heart pounding. Should he run? Should he help? He crept closer, noticing the figure slumped against the steering wheel, an older white man. He hesitated for a split second. "No one's coming," Marcus muttered under his breath. It was always like that here. He knew if he didn't help, no one would. He yanked open the car door, the man's breath shallow, face pale. Marcus's stomach twisted. He recognized him. It was that rich guy, Richard Sterling, the guy who looked at people like Marcus as if they were beneath him. And yet, here he was, needing Marcus more than ever. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the air as Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He could hear the faint sound of a horn blaring in the distance, but his focus was locked on the unconscious man in the driver's seat, Richard Sterling. Come on, Marcus muttered to himself, snapping out of his daze. He could see that Richard wasn't moving, and the car's engine was still smoking. If it caught fire, there wouldn't be much time. Marcus had grown up knowing when to mind his own business, but this was different. He couldn't just walk away, not this time. He reached in, his hands shaking slightly, and unbuckled Richard's seatbelt. He dragged the man's heavy body out of the car, groaning with the effort. "Help!" Marcus yelled into the empty street, but he knew there would be no answer. No one was coming. Not in this part of town. The neighborhood had a reputation, and people stayed out of it if they could. Richard's breathing was shallow, and his eyes fluttered slightly, but he wasn't fully conscious. Marcus knew enough about first aid from school to realize that Richard might not survive if help didn't come soon. The man needed medical attention, and fast. Marcus glanced down at the cracked screen of his phone. No signal. Of course, there wouldn't be any service here. He cursed under his breath, looking around frantically. The closest hospital was miles away, and Marcus didn't have a car. "I'll figure this out," Marcus whispered, mostly to himself. He propped Richard against a lamppost and began pacing, his mind racing. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get away from this man and avoid the trouble that was sure to follow. After all, Richard Sterling was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to blame Marcus if something went wrong, just because of the color of his skin. But something deeper tugged at Marcus. His conscience wouldn't let him walk away. He had to help, even if it meant risking his own safety. Suddenly, a memory flashed in Marcus's mind, his mother's voice telling him to always do the right thing, no matter what. "You've got to be better than them, Marcus," she used to say. "Show them what real strength looks like." Marcus knelt beside Richard, shaking him gently. "Hey, you gotta wake up, man. I can't carry you all the way to the hospital." Richard groaned, his eyes slowly opening. He looked disoriented, his face a mix of confusion and pain. His gaze met Marcus's, and for a split second a flicker of recognition passed through Richard's eyes. "You?" Richard rasped, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, it's me," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "And you're lucky I was here, or you'd be a goner." Richard tried to speak, but a fit of coughing overtook him, and Marcus could see that the man was in no shape to argue. He glanced up the street, hoping to see headlights or hear the sound of an ambulance, but there was nothing. It was just him and Richard. "I'm going to get you out of here," Marcus said, determination hardening in his voice. "Stay with me. He gripped Richard's arm and started pulling him, step by step, away from the wreckage. Marcus wasn't sure where he was taking him, but he had to get Richard to a safer spot before figuring out what to do next. As they moved, Richard mumbled something under his breath. Marcus didn't catch it at first, but then he heard it again, clearer this time. Why? Why would you help me? Marcus didn't answer at first. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Why would he help a man like Richard Sterling, a man who had likely never shown kindness to someone like him? Because it's the right thing to do, Marcus finally said, his voice low but firm. Even if you don't deserve it. Richard's eyes fluttered closed again, and Marcus kept moving, dragging him toward the dim lights of a nearby building. His muscles ached, and his mind was clouded with doubt, but he pushed through. There was no turning back now. It had been hours since the crash, and Marcus sat in the corner of the hospital waiting room, his leg bouncing anxiously. He'd managed to flag down a passing car eventually, convincing the driver to help him get Richard to the emergency room. The doctors had rushed Richard into surgery, and Marcus was left to wait. He stared at the sterile white walls of the hospital, his mind racing. What would happen now? Would Richard survive? And even if he did, what would he do when he found out who had saved him? Marcus wasn't sure why he had stuck around. He could have just walked away after getting Richard to the hospital, but something had kept him there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange sense of unfinished business between them. A nurse entered the waiting room, her shoes squeaking softly against the floor. "Are you here for Mr. Sterling?" she asked, glancing down at the clipboard in her hands. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "He's stable," the nurse said, offering a small smile. "It was a close call, but he's going to be okay." Relief washed over Marcus, but it was quickly followed by a surge of uncertainty. What now? Should he go see Richard? Should he leave before anyone could ask questions? Before he could decide, the nurse continued, "Mr. Sterling is asking for you. He's awake." Marcus blinked in surprise. Richard was asking for him? Why? "Do you want to see him?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I should." She led him down a long corridor, the smell of disinfectant and the faint hum of machines filling the air. Marcus's stomach twisted with each step. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, or what Richard would say to him. The nurse stopped in front of a door and gestured for Marcus to enter. "He's right in there. Just let me know if you need anything." Marcus swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, and Richard lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to various machines. His face was pale, and his eyes were half closed. But when Marcus stepped inside, Richard's gaze snapped toward him. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the silence between them thick and heavy. Then, Richard spoke, his voice raspy and weak. "You saved my life." Marcus shrugged, trying to play it off. Someone had to. Richard's lips twitched, almost as if he was trying to smile, but then his expression grew serious. "Why?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He could have lied. He could have said it was out of pure goodness, but the truth was more complicated. "I don't know," Marcus said finally. "Maybe because I'm not like you." Richard's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, I'm not the kind of person who lets someone die just because of what they think of me. You probably wouldn't have done the same for me, but that's on you. I did what I had to do because it was right." Richard didn't respond at first. His gaze shifted to the ceiling, and for the first time Marcus saw something different in the man's eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, maybe even regret. "I didn't think... someone like you." Richard trailed off, and Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Someone like me?" Marcus repeated, his voice tight. "Yeah, I know what you mean. But you don't know anything about me." Richard closed his eyes, a long sigh escaping his lips. "I'm starting to realize that." For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of everything left unsaid. He could walk out now, leave Richard to his thoughts, and never look back. But something told him that this was just the beginning. The hum of the hospital's machinery filled the room as Marcus stood frozen, staring at Richard Sterling. He couldn't tell whether the man's sudden display of vulnerability was genuine or just a fleeting moment of weakness. Either way, Marcus didn't trust it. The words, "I'm starting to realize that," echoed in his mind. "You're starting to realize what?" Marcus shot back, his tone sharp. "That I'm a human being? That I saved your life?" Richard's eyes opened again, but this time they held a different look. Gone was the condescending sneer Marcus had seen when they first met. Now there was something that resembled guilt, or maybe shame. Richard began, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. "I've been wrong." Marcus almost laughed, but he held back. He wasn't sure if this was some kind of trick. People like Richard Sterling didn't just wake up one day and realize their entire worldview was flawed. They didn't change overnight. "That's nice to hear," Marcus said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you know what's crazy? I didn't save you because I wanted you to realize that. I did it because I'm not a piece of trash who lets someone die, no matter who they are." Richard winced at the harshness of Marcus's words, but he didn't argue. He lay there, quiet and reflective, as if something had shifted inside him. Marcus sighed and turned toward the door. He had done his part. He'd saved the man's life, made sure he was safe, and now it was time to walk away. Whatever happened next was none of his business. As he reached for the handle, Richard's weak voice stopped him. "Wait." Marcus hesitated, but didn't turn around. "What?" "I owe you my life," Richard said quietly. "I want to make it right." Marcus felt a surge of irritation. Was this man really trying to repay him like it was some kind of debt? As if Marcus had done this for a reward. He turned back around, eyes narrowing. "Make it right?" Marcus repeated. "You can't make it right by throwing money at me or giving me some charity. That's not how it works." Richard struggled to sit up, his face pale and drawn. "No, it's not about money. I want to help you." Marcus shook his head. "I don't need your help." "Maybe not," Richard admitted, his voice hoarse. "But maybe I need yours." That stopped Marcus in his tracks. He had no idea what Richard meant by that. A man like him, wealthy, powerful, and used to getting what he wanted, didn't need help from someone like Marcus. Or did he? "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, crossing his arms. Richard's eyes flickered toward the window, the city lights casting a faint glow into the room. "I've built my life on bad choices, bad people. You don't get where I am without stepping on a lot of others." Marcus leaned against the wall, arms still crossed. He wasn't about to feel sorry for this man. Not after everything he'd probably done to people like him. "So now you're having a change of heart?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Just like that?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He stared at his hands, frail and trembling. "No, it's not that simple. I don't expect you to believe me, but something changed when you pulled me out of that car. It made me realize I've lived my life in a way that I can't take back, but maybe I can do something to make it better." Marcus remained silent, watching the man in front of him grapple with what sounded like years of regret. "You saved me," Richard continued, "and I want to know why. Not just why you saved me, but why someone like you, someone I've ignored, looked down on, would do that." Marcus uncrossed his arms, exhaling deeply. "I told you why. I saved you because it was the right thing to do, not because of who you are or what you've done." Richard nodded, a weak smile forming on his lips. "That's exactly what I don't understand. I've lived in a world where no one does anything without expecting something in return." Marcus shook his head. "Maybe that's your world, but it's not mine." The room grew quiet again, the tension slowly fading. Marcus could see that Richard was struggling with something deeper, but he wasn't sure what. The man's empire, his fortune, everything that had made him untouchable, seemed meaningless in this moment. Finally, Marcus spoke again. Look, I'm not here to fix you. Whatever guilt you're feeling, that's on you to deal with. I'm not going to stick around for some redemption arc." Richard nodded slowly. "I understand." Marcus turned back to the door, ready to leave, when Richard's voice stopped him one more time. "Marcus." He paused, looking over his shoulder. "I'm not asking you to stay, but if you ever change your mind, I'd like to offer you something better, something more than just money." Marcus studied Richard for a moment, trying to figure out if this was genuine. He couldn't tell. He wasn't sure if Richard had really changed, or if this was just the first step in a long con. Either way, Marcus had his own life to live. "I'll think about it," Marcus said curtly before stepping out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. As he walked down the corridor, his mind raced. Part of him wanted to forget about Richard Sterling altogether, but another part, the one his mother had raised, told him that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make something good out of this. A chance to show the world and people like Richard that there was more to life than just power and money. But he wasn't going to get his hopes up. Days passed, and Marcus tried to push the events of that night out of his mind. He went back to his regular routine, working part-time at the local auto shop and taking night classes at the community college. Life had returned to its usual grind, but something nagged at him. The conversation with Richard lingered in the back of his mind, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. Then, one day, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Richard Sterling. Marcus stood at his kitchen table, staring at the envelope. The address was written in neat, expensive handwriting, and the seal on the back was embossed with a gold insignia, something that screamed old money. Marcus almost tossed it in the trash without opening it, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside was a simple letter written on heavy paper. "Marcus, I hope this letter finds you well. I've had time to reflect on our conversation in the hospital, and I want to extend an invitation to meet again. No strings attached. I've come to realize that there are things I can learn from you and perhaps things I can offer you in return. You have my word that this is not about charity or obligation. It's about understanding. I've spent too long in a world that doesn't understand people like you, and I'd like to change that, starting with myself. If you're interested, meet me at the address below. If not, I'll respect your decision. Sincerely, Richard Sterling." Marcus stared at the letter for a long time, unsure what to make of it. He didn't want to be pulled into whatever game Richard was playing, but something about the letter felt different. It didn't feel like an offer of charity or a bribe, it felt genuine. But could he trust it? He folded the letter and shoved it into his pocket, still unsure of what to do. The address Richard had given was in the wealthy part of town, far from where Marcus lived. It would be easy enough to ignore it, to pretend he'd never received the letter, but a small part of him wondered what would happen if he didn't. For the rest of the day, Marcus's mind was consumed by thoughts of Richard. What kind of man was he really? Had the accident and near-death experience changed him, or was this just another chapter in a life built on deception? That night, Marcus made his decision. He was going to find out. Marcus had never been to this part of town before. As he walked through the gated entrance of the upscale neighborhood, the contrast between his world and Richard Sterling's became more glaring with every step. The streets were lined with perfectly manicured lawns, towering trees, and sprawling mansions that seemed worlds away from the rundown apartments and dilapidated shops he'd grown up around. Richard's home, a vast estate tucked behind high walls and security gates, loomed ahead of him like a fortress. Marcus stopped in front of the gate, second-guessing his decision. Was this really the right move? He could turn around now, head back to his side of town and forget all about Richard and his so-called offer, but something kept him rooted in place. Before Marcus could change his mind, the gate slid open with a quiet hum, and a man in a black suit appeared, gesturing for him to come in. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you," the man said in a professional tone. "Please follow me." Marcus nodded silently, his stomach tightening with unease as he stepped through the gate and into Richard's world. The path leading to the front door was paved with smooth stone, and the garden was immaculate, with flower beds bursting with color and fountains trickling in the background. It was a far cry from the cracked sidewalks and broken streetlights Marcus was used to. Inside the house, everything felt even more surreal. The foyer was grand, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and high ceilings that seemed to stretch forever. Marcus had never been in a place like this, and he couldn't help but feel out of place, like he didn't belong. But he wasn't here to be impressed by Richard's wealth. He was here to find out if the man had really changed. The butler, or whatever the man in the suit was, led Marcus through a series of corridors until they reached a large room at the back of the house. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a massive window overlooked the pristine gardens. In the middle of the room sat Richard, looking significantly better than the last time Marcus had seen him. "Marcus," Richard said, standing up from his chair with a strained smile, "I'm glad you came." Marcus remained silent for a moment, sizing Richard up. The man seemed different, but he wasn't ready to trust him just yet. He took a step into the room, his eyes flicking around at the opulence surrounding him. "I wasn't sure if I would," Marcus said finally, his voice flat. Richard nodded, as if he understood. "I don't blame you. After everything, I wouldn't have expected you to." There was a moment of awkward silence, the tension between them palpable. Marcus felt like he was being tested somehow, as if Richard was waiting for him to make the first move. But Marcus wasn't here to play games. "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked bluntly, crossing his arms. Richard looked down, seemingly searching for the right words. "I want to thank you, first of all. What you did, it wasn't something many people would have done, especially after the way I've treated you and others like you. I've been thinking a lot since the accident, and I realize I've lived my life in a way that I'm not proud of." Marcus raised an eyebrow, still skeptical. "So what? You want to make up for it by inviting me to your fancy house and saying sorry?" Richard shook his head. "No, it's not that simple. I know an apology isn't enough, but I want to do more than just say I'm sorry. I want to offer you an opportunity, something that can change both of our lives." Marcus narrowed his eyes, unsure of what Richard meant. What kind of opportunity? Richard motioned for Marcus to sit, but Marcus remained standing. With a sigh, Richard continued. "I've built my wealth and my business in ways that, looking back, I'm not proud of. I've hurt people, Marcus, people like you, and I can't undo that. But I can change the way I move forward. I need help to do that, and I think you can help me see the world differently." Marcus frowned, his arms still crossed. "You want me to help you? After everything you've done?" Richard nodded. "Yes. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth, someone who can show me what I've been blind to for so long. You've already opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect, Marcus. I think you can help me rebuild, not just my business, but myself." Marcus was taken aback. This wasn't what he had expected. He had thought Richard would offer him money or some kind of token gesture, but this? Asking for help to change his ways? It was the last thing Marcus had anticipated. "You really think I can help you?" Marcus asked, his tone skeptical. "I know you can," Richard said quietly, "but it's not just about me. I want to help you too. I know you don't need charity, but I can give you access to resources, connections, opportunities that you might not have otherwise. We can work together, Marcus. Build something better." Marcus stood there, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk out, to tell Richard to fix his own mess, but another part of him, the part that had been raised to believe in second chances, felt a pull toward something bigger. Maybe this was an opportunity, not just for Richard, but for himself as well. "I don't know," Marcus said after a long pause. "It sounds too good to be true." "Why me?" "Because you're the only one who's been honest with me," Richard replied. "Everyone else in my life, my family, my business partners, they all tell me what I want to hear. But you've got no reason to lie to me. You've seen the world I've ignored for so long. I need that perspective if I'm going to change." Marcus felt a flicker of something. Was it curiosity? Hope? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. This was about something bigger, an opportunity to make a real difference, not just in Richard's life, but in his own. "What exactly are you offering?" Marcus asked cautiously. Richard's eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time there was a sense of sincerity there that Marcus hadn't seen before. "I'm offering you a chance to help me rebuild my business in a way that's ethical, fair, and inclusive. You'll have a say in decisions that affect real people, people like you, and in return, I'll give you access to resources and opportunities that can help you build your future. It's a partnership, Marcus, one that could change both of our lives." Marcus stared at Richard, his mind spinning. Could this really be real? Could a man like Richard Sterling really change? And could Marcus trust him enough to take that chance? "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally, his voice guarded but not dismissive. Richard smiled, a genuine one this time. "That's all I'm asking." As Marcus left the mansion, walking back through the same gates he had entered, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to take a turn he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't turning back. Marcus spent the next few days mulling over Richard's offer, replaying their conversation in his mind over and over. He wanted to believe that Richard was sincere, that the man had really changed. But years of distrust, built on experience, made it hard for Marcus to take that leap of faith. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Richard than he was letting on. Maybe he really was trying to make up for his past mistakes, or maybe this was just another way for him to maintain control. Marcus didn't know, but one thing was clear. If he was going to consider working with Richard, he needed to know more about the man. So, Marcus did what he always did when he needed answers. He dug deeper. He spent hours researching Richard's business empire, combing through news articles, financial reports, and anything else he could find. It didn't take long for Marcus to uncover the darker side of Richard's success. Behind the polished image of a wealthy philanthropist was a trail of shady deals, backroom negotiations, and unethical practices that had hurt countless people. One particular deal caught Marcus's attention. A real estate development project in his own neighborhood. Years ago, Richard's company had bought up blocks of low-income housing, forcing families to relocate with little compensation. Marcus's own family had been one of the casualties, losing their home and being pushed into an even worse situation. As Marcus read the details of the deal, his blood boiled. Richard had profited off the misery of people like him, and now he wanted Marcus to help him fix things. It felt like a cruel joke. But even as anger surged through him, Marcus couldn't deny the opportunity that lay before him. Richard's offer, if real, could give him the chance to right some of the wrongs that had been done, to his family, to his community, to people like him. It was a tempting thought, but it was also dangerous. Could he really trust Richard enough to work with him? And more importantly, could he forgive the man for what he had done? Marcus didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. Before he made any decisions, he needed to confront Richard about the truth. Marcus couldn't wait any longer. The more he learned about Richard's past, the more his frustration grew. He needed to confront Richard face to face, to ask him directly about the shady real estate deal that had uprooted his family. But first, he wanted to see how the man would react under pressure when surrounded by his own family. On the day of their next meeting, Marcus walked through the towering iron gates of Richard's estate once more. This time, however, he noticed the presence of several luxury cars parked in the driveway. The tension in his chest tightened as he approached the front door. Something about today felt different. A butler opened the door, ushering Marcus inside with a polite nod. "Mr. Sterling is in the drawing room. His family is here as well." Family? Marcus hadn't been expecting that. He hadn't even considered what Richard's family might think of him. His heart raced, but he steeled himself. He wasn't here to be intimidated by a group of wealthy people. He was here for answers. When Marcus entered the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Richard sat in a plush armchair, looking noticeably better than the last time Marcus had seen him, though his complexion was still pale. Across from him sat a woman and a younger man, both impeccably dressed and exuding an air of superiority. The woman, who Marcus guessed was Richard's estranged daughter, Sophia, looked up first, her sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the sight of him. The younger man, James, leaned back in his seat with a smug smirk on his face. He looked like he was about to say something sarcastic, but Richard spoke first. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice calm but filled with an underlying tension. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Marcus hesitated for a moment, feeling all eyes on him, but he took the seat offered. The room felt suffocating, and the air of judgment from Richard's family was palpable. "I see we have company today," Marcus said, his voice level. He didn't want to appear rattled, even though the tension was thick enough to cut through. Sophia crossed her legs, tilting her head as she studied Marcus. "You must be Marcus," she said, her tone polite but distant. "My father has mentioned you." James chuckled softly. "Oh, he's mentioned you all right. The kid who saved Dad's life. Quite the heroic story." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but the comment rubbed him the wrong way. The way James said it, as if Marcus was just a prop in some story for the wealthy to admire, made his blood boil. He'd seen that look before, the one that said, "You're not one of us." "I'm not here for stories," Marcus said flatly, his eyes locking with James. "I'm here to talk business." James raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by Marcus's directness. Sophia, however, remained silent, her gaze flicking between Marcus and Richard. "Let's get to it then," Marcus continued, turning his attention to Richard. "There's something I need to ask you. I've been looking into your company, and I found something that hits close to home." Richard's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the slight shift in his posture, the tension in his jaw. He knew what was coming. "What did you find?" Richard asked carefully, though Marcus could tell he already had an idea. Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "A few years ago, your company bought up several properties in low-income neighborhoods. My family lived in one of those houses. We were forced to move with barely any compensation. That deal put us in a worse position than we'd been before. Did you know about that?" The room went silent. Sophia glanced at her father, her brows furrowing slightly, while James's smirk faltered. Richard's eyes darkened, and for the first time Marcus saw a flicker of something in the older man's face. Regret, perhaps. I knew about the deal," Richard admitted, his voice heavy. "But I didn't know the specifics. At the time, I was focused on the bigger picture, the profits, the expansion. I didn't realize the human cost." Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of anger. "You didn't realize, or you didn't care." Richard closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. "I was wrong. I won't deny that. I can't change what happened, but I want to make it right. That's part of why I offered you this opportunity, to fix the damage I've done." James scoffed from across the room, breaking the tension. "Oh, come on, Dad. Let's not pretend this is about redemption. This is about you trying to salvage what's left of your reputation before everything crumbles." Richard shot his son a warning look, but James continued, undeterred. "You think bringing him in is going to make everything better? That you can just buy your way out of the mess you've made? This is pathetic." Marcus bristled at James's tone, but before he could respond, Sophia spoke up, her voice cold and measured. "I think what my brother is trying to say, Father, is that this looks like a desperate attempt to make up for years of neglect. Our family has built its fortune on decisions like the one Marcus just mentioned. If you're serious about changing, it's going to take more than hiring one person to fix it." Richard's face tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Marcus watched the exchange closely, noting the underlying bitterness in Sophia's voice and the open hostility in James's. It was clear that this family had its own internal struggles, and Marcus had just been pulled into the middle of it. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice steady but tired. "I'm aware of the damage I've done, and I don't expect any of you to understand. But this isn't about reputation. It's about doing what's right, for once." Sophia looked at her father, her expression unreadable before turning her gaze back to Marcus. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. "Why are you here, Marcus? What do you want from all of this?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the judgment behind their questions. But he wasn't here to play their games. He was here to get answers, and maybe something more. "I'm here because I want to see if this man can really change," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm here because, unlike the rest of you, I don't have the luxury of ignoring what he's done. My family paid the price for his decisions, and now I want to see if he's willing to make things right." Sophia's eyes softened slightly, but James scoffed again, leaning forward with a sneer. "Please," James said, "you're just another pawn in his game. He'll use you like he's used everyone else, and when he's done, you'll be right back where you started, on the outside looking in." Marcus felt his fists clench, but before he could respond, Richard spoke up, his voice firm. "That's enough, James." James rolled his eyes but leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. Marcus could see that this family had its own deep fractures, and he wasn't sure how he fit into all of this. But one thing was clear. Richard's world was far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Richard turned to Marcus, his expression serious. "I know this isn't going to be easy, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to prove that I can change. I want to earn your trust and your partnership." Marcus stared at Richard, weighing his words carefully. Could he really trust this man? Could he put aside his anger long enough to see if Richard was serious about making amends? Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "You've got a long way to go, Richard, but I'm willing to see where this leads." The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but there was a shift, a moment of understanding, however brief. Marcus wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, he had taken the first step toward finding out. As he left the Sterling estate that day, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a storm that could either destroy everything or reveal something worth fighting for. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus found himself unexpectedly drawn deeper into Richard Sterling's world. The more time they spent together, the more Marcus began to see a side of Richard that few had ever glimpsed, a side that was vulnerable, remorseful, and determined to change. But change wasn't easy, and the world that Richard had built over the years wasn't one that could be transformed overnight. Richard invited Marcus to his office downtown, a stark contrast to the mansion. The sleek, modern building, with its glass walls and minimalist design, felt more like a fortress of wealth and power than a place of change. Marcus entered cautiously, feeling the weight of eyes on him as he walked past Richard's employees, most of whom were undoubtedly wondering what he was doing there. Richard greeted him in the lobby, dressed in a sharp suit, but his expression was softer than Marcus had ever seen before. "Thanks for coming," Richard said, leading Marcus into a private meeting room. "I wanted to show you something." Marcus followed Richard into the room, where a large screen displayed various data and documents. Richard gestured to the screen. "This is what I've been working on. It's a plan to restructure my business, to make it more ethical, more inclusive. But I need your help to make sure I get it right." Marcus stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the moment. This was real. Richard was serious about changing, and he was asking Marcus to be part of that change. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," Marcus said honestly. "I'm not a businessman." Richard smiled faintly. "You're more than that, Marcus. You have something that most people in my world don't. Perspective. That's what I need right now." Marcus studied the screen, his mind racing. This was an opportunity he hadn't expected, a chance to influence something bigger than himself. But it also came with risks. Could he really trust Richard? And more importantly, could he trust himself to navigate this world? "I'll help," Marcus said after a long pause, "but I'm not going to sugarcoat things. If I see something wrong, I'm going to call you out on it." Richard nodded, his expression serious. "That's exactly what I want." As they began working together, Marcus saw firsthand how deeply entrenched Richard's business practices were in a world of greed and exploitation. It wasn't just about making profits, it was about crushing competition, cutting corners, and keeping the wealthy on top. But Richard was determined to change that. He involved Marcus in every major decision, listening to his advice, even when it was uncomfortable. Slowly but surely, the company began to shift. Small changes at first, but enough to make a difference. And as they worked together, something else began to happen. A bond began to form between them. Marcus hadn't expected it, but as they spent more time together, he started to see Richard as more than just a wealthy businessman. He saw a man who was flawed, broken even, but who was trying, really trying, to make things right. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Richard invited Marcus to join him for dinner at a nearby restaurant. They sat in a quiet corner, away from the prying eyes of the public, and for the first time Richard opened up about his past. "I wasn't always like this," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. "When I was younger, I had big dreams of building something great. But somewhere along the way, I got lost. I started caring more about money and power than people." Marcus listened quietly, sensing the weight of Richard's confession. "I hurt a lot of people, Marcus," Richard continued, "and I can't undo that. But I can try to make things better from here on out." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of what Richard was saying. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for a chance to change. And in that moment, Marcus realized that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance too. A chance to make a real difference, not just in Richard's life, but in his own. Marcus followed Richard into the room where a large screen displayed various data and documents. Richard gestured to the screen. "This is what I've been working on. It's a plan to restructure my business, to make it more ethical, more inclusive. But I need your help to make sure I get it right." Marcus stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the moment. This was real. Richard was serious about changing, and he was asking Marcus to be part of that change. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," Marcus said honestly. "I'm not a businessman." Richard smiled faintly. "You're more than that, Marcus. You have something that most people in my world don't. Perspective. That's what I need right now." Marcus studied the screen, his mind racing. This was an opportunity he hadn't expected, a chance to influence something bigger than himself. But it also came with risks. Could he really trust Richard? And more importantly, could he trust himself to navigate this world? "I'll help," Marcus said after a long pause. "But I'm not going to sugarcoat things. If I see something wrong, I'm going to call you out on it." Richard nodded, his expression serious. "That's exactly what I want." As they began working together, Marcus saw firsthand how deeply entrenched Richard's business practices were in a world of greed and exploitation. It wasn't just about making profits, it was about crushing competition, cutting corners, and keeping the wealthy on top. But Richard was determined to change that. He involved Marcus in every major decision, listening to his advice, even when it was uncomfortable. Slowly but surely, the company began to shift. Small changes at first, but enough to make a difference. And as they worked together, something else began to happen. A bond began to form between them. Marcus hadn't expected it, but as they spent more time together, he started to see Richard as more than just a wealthy businessman. He saw a man who was flawed, broken even, but who was trying, really trying, to make things right. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Richard invited Marcus to join him for dinner at a nearby restaurant. They sat in a quiet corner, away from the prying eyes of the public, and for the first time, Richard opened up about his past. "I wasn't always like this," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. "When I was younger, I had big dreams of building something great. But somewhere along the way, I got lost. I started caring more about money and power than people." Marcus listened quietly, sensing the weight of Richard's confession. "I hurt a lot of people, Marcus," Richard continued, "and I can't undo that. But I can try to make things better from here on out." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of what Richard was saying. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for a chance to change. And in that moment, Marcus realized that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance too. A chance to make a real difference, not just in Richard's life, but in his own. Months passed, and the changes Marcus and Richard implemented in the business were starting to show results. Richard's company was slowly evolving into something new, more ethical, more transparent, and more inclusive. Marcus's role in this transformation grew, and he found himself becoming more involved in high-level decisions. However, not everyone was happy with these changes. Richard's son, James, had grown increasingly resentful, his disdain for Marcus bubbling to the surface in every meeting. James was vocal about his opposition to the new direction, and his impatience turned into a full-blown rebellion when he attempted to wrest control of the company from his father. It all came to a head one evening when James cornered Marcus in the boardroom after a tense meeting. "You think you've won, don't you?" James sneered, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've turned my father into some kind of saint? This company was built on power, and I'm not about to let some outsider take that away." Marcus stared back at James, refusing to be intimidated. "This isn't about me, James. It's about doing what's right. For the business, for your father, and for the people who've been hurt." James stepped closer, his voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "You don't belong here. My father might think he's found redemption, but all he's doing is destroying everything he's built, and I'll make sure he realizes that before it's too late." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're the one who doesn't see the bigger picture. This isn't about money and power anymore, it's about people." James glared at Marcus, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat, before storming out of the room. Marcus knew that James wouldn't back down easily, and the weeks that followed proved it. James launched a hostile takeover bid, attempting to undermine every decision Marcus and Richard made. It was a battle for the soul of the company, and the tension grew unbearable. But, in the end, it wasn't brute force or manipulation that won the day. It was Richard's quiet resolve. Richard stood before the board of directors one final time, addressing the concerns that James had raised. His voice was steady but firm as he laid out the future of the company, one built on integrity, respect, and fairness. And with Marcus by his side, he made it clear that the old ways of doing business were gone for good. The board voted overwhelmingly in favor of Richard's vision, and James's attempt to take over was thwarted. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The tides had turned. That night, after the vote, Marcus and Richard stood on the balcony of the Sterling estate, looking out over the city. The air was cool, and the lights of the city flickered in the distance. "You did it," Marcus said quietly, glancing at Richard. Richard shook his head. "We did it. I couldn't have gotten here without you." Marcus smiled faintly. "I didn't think this was possible when we first started. I didn't think you could change." Richard's face softened, his eyes reflecting the years of mistakes and the path to redemption he'd fought so hard to walk. "I didn't either, but you showed me that it was." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The changes they had made were a foundation for something bigger, something lasting. "I'm proud of what we've done," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But there's still more work to do." Richard nodded. "There always is." As Marcus looked out at the city, he felt a sense of hope, a belief that people could change, that even the most flawed could find redemption if they were willing to face their past and fight for a better future. The months that followed were a whirlwind of rebuilding, but in a different sense than Marcus had imagined. The company began thriving under its new direction, and Richard, no longer the ruthless businessman he once was, found peace in the legacy he was leaving behind, a legacy of fairness, growth, and redemption. For Marcus, the journey wasn't just about helping Richard, it was about finding his own path, about realizing his potential to create change. The boy, who had once saved a stranger's life on the street, had become someone who could influence an entire empire. Richard's family, though still fractured, had begun to heal. Sophia, seeing the changes in her father, started to reconcile with him, while James, though bitter, eventually accepted that the world was changing, and he would have to change with it. But, most importantly, Marcus had learned that real power didn't come from money or status. It came from doing the right thing, even when it was hard. It came from standing up for what mattered, no matter the odds. In the end, Marcus had become more than just the boy who saved Richard Sterling's life. He had become a catalyst for change, Proof that even the most broken systems could be rebuilt if enough people were willing to do the work. What do you think about Marcus's journey? Can people truly change, or are they bound by their past? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if you're looking for more inspiring and gripping stories, click that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Stay tuned for more amazing content, and remember, sometimes even the most unexpected moments can change our lives forever. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.